Dutch volunteers in the Waffen-SS fought for Germany on the Eastern Front. They fought in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Baltic states. They fought outside Leningrad, along the Volkhov River, and later at Narva in 1944. They wore German uniforms and swore an oath to Adolf Hitler. Their own country had been occupied since May 1940. Rotterdam had been bombed. The Dutch army had surrendered after 5 days of fighting. The government operated in exile from London. Yet over the next 4 years, thousands of Dutchmen made the decision to serve in the Waffen-SS. They did not all join for the same reasons. Some were committed fascists who had supported Anton Mussert's NSB before the war. Some were defending Europe against Bolshevism. Some were drawn by ideology, by opportunity, by conviction, or by ambition. On the Eastern Front, those motivations were reduced to something simpler: cold, artillery, attrition. The Dutch SS formations suffered heavy losses in the forests south of Leningrad. They were reorganized, rebuilt, and sent back into combat. By 1944, they were holding defensive lines in Estonia as the Red Army advanced westward. Nearly half of the men who went east would not survive the war. When the fighting ended, the survivors returned to a country that regarded them not as veterans but as collaborators. They were prosecuted, imprisoned, in some cases executed. In Dutch law, their choice was treason. In their own words, many claimed they had fought for Europe. The tension between those two claims has never entirely disappeared. Here is the full story of the Dutch SS. In the early morning hours of the 10th of May, 1940, the Netherlands ceased to be a neutral country. German paratroopers descended on The Hague, Rotterdam and Dordrecht before dawn had fully broken. Junkers transport aircraft roared low over the flat Dutch countryside, disgorging men and equipment onto airfields that Dutch defenders had not yet mobilized to protect. The army of a nation that had remained outside the First World War, that had clung to neutrality as a matter of national identity and practical survival, was now fighting for its existence against the most powerful military machine in Europe. The Dutch armed forces resisted. The point deserves emphasis, because it is sometimes lost in the larger narrative of the Western campaigns of 1940. The Dutch fought. At the Grebbeberg, along the Grebbe Line, soldiers of the Royal Netherlands Army held their positions under sustained assault for days. At Rotterdam, the defenders refused to yield to German ultimatums. The response from the Luftwaffe came on the 14th of May. The bombing of Rotterdam killed approximately 900 civilians and reduced the commercial centre of the city to rubble. Within hours, Dutch commanders received word that Utrecht and other cities faced the same fate. On the 15th of May 1940, General Henry Winkelmann signed the instrument of surrender. The entire campaign had lasted 5 days. For a country that had not experienced foreign occupation since the Napoleonic era, the shock was not merely military. It reached into the foundations of national identity. The Netherlands had survived the First World War intact while the rest of Europe bled itself white. It had built its self-image around a form of principled non-involvement, a small nation navigating between great powers through commerce, international law, and careful diplomacy. All of that was now gone. What replaced it was a German military administration under Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, a man who would eventually be hanged at Nuremberg. But the political rupture of May 1940 was not simply a story of occupation from without. Inside Dutch society, there were men who had been waiting for precisely this moment. Anton Mussert had founded the National Socialistische Beweging, the NSB, in 1931. The movement had grown steadily through the Depression years, reaching its peak electoral support in the provincial elections of 1935, where it obtained nearly 8% of the vote. That figure is worth sitting with for a moment. In a democratic country with a free press and strong civil institutions, 1 in 12 Dutch voters had chosen a fascist party at the ballot box. Mussert was not a fringe figure operating in a political cellar. He was a civil engineer by training, a man of the professional class who spoke the language of order, discipline, national renewal, and anti-communism to an audience that found that language compelling. Mussert's relationship with Nazi Germany was, however, complicated from the beginning. He was a Dutch nationalist first. He wanted an independent Netherlands that cooperated with Germany, not a Netherlands absorbed into the German Reich. The Germans, for their part, had their own ideas about what Dutch collaboration should look like and what it should produce. That tension would never fully resolve itself. But in the immediate aftermath of May 1940, it hardly mattered. What mattered was that the NSB suddenly found itself in an entirely new political environment, one where the power behind its ideology held military control over Dutch territory. Other Dutch fascists were less concerned about the question of national independence. Heinrich Himmler's SS and its recruitment apparatus had a specific vision. The Germanic peoples of northwestern Europe, the Dutch, the Flemish Belgians, the Danes, the Norwegians, were not, in the racial taxonomy of National Socialism, enemies or inferior races. They were brothers, cousins, blood relatives of the German people who had simply been separated by the accidents of history and nation-state formation. The concept of a pan-Germanic community, a Germanische Gemeinschaft encompassing all the Nordic and Germanic peoples of Europe, was not merely propaganda. It was a sincere ideological framework within Himmler's SS, however grotesque its practical applications. This classification had immediate practical consequences. From the very first months of the German occupation, the SS began recruiting Dutch volunteers for military service. They were not being asked to betray their country and serve a foreign power. They were being invited, so the narrative went, to join a larger community of which they had always been a part. The SS Hauptamt, the main SS office responsible for recruitment and personnel, established offices in the Netherlands and began identifying men who might be receptive to the call. The question is not whether this recruitment happened. It did. The question that hangs over everything that follows is the one posed in the title of this documentary. What were these men? What drove them? What did they do? And how should history account for them? To understand the Dutch volunteers who eventually served in Waffen-SS formations, it is necessary to understand the political and ideological landscape of the Netherlands in the years before 1940. The Netherlands was not a country without its own fascist tradition, and that tradition did not arrive fully formed with the German occupation. It had deep roots that stretched back through the 1930s. Anton Adrian Mussert was born in 1894 in Werkendam. He studied civil engineering at Delft, graduated with distinction, and built a successful career with the Rijkswaterstaat, the Dutch Public Works Administration. He was, by all outward appearances, a respectable figure of the professional bourgeoisie. But Mussert had absorbed the nationalist and anti-communist currents of his time with unusual intensity. The perceived threat of Soviet Bolshevism, the economic dislocation of the Depression, and the apparent failure of parliamentary democracy to address these challenges drove him toward radical politics. The NSB he founded in 1931 was modelled explicitly on the NSDAP, but with distinctly Dutch characteristics. Mussert insisted on Dutch territorial integrity and Dutch sovereignty. He was anti-communist, anti-Marxist, and suspicious of what he characterised as Jewish influence in Dutch political and economic life. But he was not, at least initially, calling for Dutch absorption into a German racial empire. He wanted a Netherlands that would find its place within a broader European order, dominated by fascist states, while retaining its own national character. The movement grew. By 1935 it had approximately 50,000 members and was drawing significant votes in regional elections. The image of the NSB member marching in uniform through Dutch streets, giving the fascist salute, shouting nationalist slogans, was not an aberration. It was a visible feature of Dutch political life throughout the middle years of the decade. Dutch society watched this growth with alarm, and the mainstream political parties responded with increasing pressure. After 1935, the NSB's electoral support declined. The introduction of Jewish and Jehovah's Witness members as targets for NSB rhetoric pushed many ordinary Dutchmen away. By the eve of the German invasion, the movement was in political retreat, but it retained its core membership, its organisational structure, and its ideological commitments, and it retained Anton Mussert. Beyond the NSB, there was a smaller but more radical tendency in Dutch fascism, represented by figures like Mynoob Martin Rost van Tonningen. Rost van Tonningen was a financial official who had worked for the League of Nations in Austria and had developed extremely close ties with the German SS. Where Mussert was a Dutch nationalist, Rost van Tonningen was a convinced pan-Germanist. He genuinely believed in the racial unity of the Germanic peoples and had no particular attachment to Dutch national sovereignty as a concept worth preserving. He saw the Netherlands as a Germanic province temporarily separated from its natural community by historical circumstance. After the German occupation, Rost van Tonningen became one of the most enthusiastic collaborators in the country, eventually taking control of the Dutch central bank and key elements of the Dutch financial system for German benefit. The significance of this division within Dutch fascism cannot be understated. It meant that, from the very beginning of the occupation, German authorities were dealing with Dutch collaborators who had fundamentally different visions of what collaboration meant and what it was supposed to achieve. Mussert wanted recognition as the political leader of an independent Dutch state operating within the German orbit. Himmler and the SS wanted Dutch volunteers for their formations and had little interest in the political ambitions of a Dutch nationalist politician. These competing interests produced constant friction throughout the occupation years. Anti-communism was the thread that ran through virtually all of these ideological strands. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet Union had produced a deep and persistent anxiety throughout European conservative and nationalist circles. The Spanish Civil War, which ended with Franco's victory in 1939, had framed the entire European political conflict in terms of a battle between nationalist Christian civilization and godless Bolshevism. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, this framework provided the essential recruitment narrative for SS volunteers across occupied Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, changed everything about the nature of SS recruitment in the Netherlands and across Western Europe. The war in the West had been a conventional, if brutal, military campaign. The war in the East was from its inception something categorically different. But for the men who would volunteer for Dutch SS formations, the ideological framing was clear. This was the crusade against Bolshevism that European nationalists had been anticipating for years. This was the moment of decision. The formal apparatus of Dutch SS recruitment had actually preceded Barbarossa by several months. From the autumn of 1940, German authorities had begun integrating Dutch volunteers into existing SS formations. The most significant of these early structures was the SS Standard Westland. The Westland Regiment had been established as a motorized infantry unit within the broader framework of the SS Division Viking, which was being assembled from Germanic volunteers across occupied Europe. Dutch recruits were channeled into Westland alongside Flemish Belgians and volunteers from other Germanic territories. The regiment trained in Germany and was part of the Viking Division when that formation was committed to combat on the Eastern Front following Barbarossa. The nature of who was signing up in these early months is important to establish. The initial volunteers for SS service were disproportionately drawn from the NSB membership and from the more radical pan-Germanist circles around Rost van Tonningen. These were men who had made an ideological commitment before the war, who came to SS service with at least a reasonably clear understanding of what they were joining and what it represented. Estimates of the total NSB membership at the time of the German invasion range between 25,000 and 30,000 active members. From this pool, a significant proportion of younger men of military age would eventually enter German military or paramilitary service in one form or another. But the ideological volunteers were not the whole story. As the occupation continued and the recruiting apparatus expanded, the profile of the Dutch volunteer broadened. Some men signed up for economic reasons, drawn by the pay, the uniforms, and the prospect of steady employment in a country where the German occupation had disrupted normal economic activity. Others were motivated by adventure, by a desire to escape difficult personal circumstances, or by social pressure from communities where NSB membership was concentrated. The motivations were, as they almost always are in such cases, mixed, layered, and not easily reduced to a single explanatory framework. The critical organisational development came in the summer of 1941, immediately following the launch of Barbarossa. On the 24th of June 1941, just 2 days after the German invasion of the Soviet Union began, a Dutch volunteer formation was announced. The Vrijwilligerslegioen Nederland, the Dutch Volunteer Legion, was established under direct SS auspices and began recruiting almost immediately. The announcement framing the Legion's purpose was explicit. This was not simply military service to Germany, it was a contribution to the European crusade against Bolshevism. Dutch volunteers were being invited to defend European civilization, Christian values, and the Dutch way of life against the Soviet threat. Anton Mussert himself endorsed the recruitment drive, despite his continued desire to maintain some distance from direct subordination to German command structures. The anti-communist framing was the one point on which the various strands of Dutch collaboration could agree. The Vrijwilligerslegioen Nederland was organised as a separate unit from the Westland Regiment and the Wiking Division. It was designed to maintain a degree of nominal Dutch national identity, with its own command structure that initially included Dutch officers. Recruitment proceeded through 1941, and training was conducted at facilities in Germany. Volunteers swore an oath, the precise wording of which was calibrated to acknowledge service to Adolf Hitler as the leader of the European struggle against Bolshevism, while also incorporating references to the Netherlands. The oath question was not trivial. Swearing personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler was a significant act, and German authorities were aware that some potential recruits were reluctant to do so in terms that implied they were renouncing their Dutch identity entirely. The oath formulas used for Western European volunteers were typically somewhat different from the oath sworn by German members of the Waffen-SS, though the practical effect was the same. The volunteer was committing himself to military service under German command for the duration of the war. Historians estimate that the Vrijwilligerslegioen Nederland reached a strength of approximately 3,000 men by the time it was committed to combat. This figure, while significant, should be understood in context. The total Dutch population in 1940 was approximately 9 million people. The 3,000 volunteers of the Legion represented a small but not insignificant fraction of the male population of military age, and they were drawn from a subset of Dutch society with specific ideological characteristics. They were not representative of the Dutch population as a whole. Beyond the Legion, Dutch volunteers continued to be recruited for other SS formations throughout the occupation. The Westland Regiment within the Wiking Division continued to draw Dutch personnel. Various police and auxiliary formations also recruited Dutch men for service within the Netherlands and in occupied Eastern territories. The total number of Dutch men who served in German military formations of various kinds during the occupation is estimated by historians at between 20,000 and 25,000 across all categories, though the figure for those who served in frontline Waffen-SS combat units is considerably lower, in the range of 8,000 to 10,000. These numbers are contested in the scholarship and should be understood as estimates rather than precise figures. The record-keeping of the various recruitment agencies was inconsistent. Personnel moved between formations, and the definition of what constituted active military service as opposed to auxiliary or police functions varied. What is not contested is that a meaningful number of Dutch men made the choice to take up arms in German service, and that many of them served on the Eastern Front under conditions of extreme violence. The Vrijwilligerslegioen Nederland was deployed to the Eastern Front in late 1941, arriving in the operational area of Army Group North as the German advance had already begun to slow in the face of Soviet resistance, logistical strain, and the approach of the Russian winter. Army Group North had driven through the Baltic states with extraordinary speed in the initial weeks of Barbarossa. Riga fell on the 1st of July. By September, German forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad and completed the encirclement of the city. But Leningrad did not fall. The siege that began in September 1941 would last until January 1944, becoming one of the most prolonged and devastating sieges in military history. It was in this operational context around Leningrad and along the Volkhov River to the south and east that Dutch SS volunteers would spend the majority of their combat service over the following years. The terrain of the Leningrad front was nothing that the Dutch recruits coming from the flat, orderly landscape of the Netherlands could have adequately prepared for. The region was dominated by forests, marshes, and rivers. Roads were poor and became effectively impassable in autumn mud and winter cold. Temperatures in the winter of 1941 to 42 dropped to extremes that killed men who were inadequately equipped and inadequately trained for such conditions. The initial German expectation of a short campaign had left the Wehrmacht and its allied formations without adequate winter gear, and the men of the Dutch Volunteer Legion suffered accordingly. The Legion was initially positioned in the area around Leningrad and along the Volkhov front, where German and Soviet forces were locked in a grinding attritional struggle. The Volkhov River formed a key axis of this fighting. Soviet forces under General Kirill Meretskov launched repeated attempts to break through German lines and relieve Leningrad, and the German formations holding the line fought desperately to prevent these breakthroughs. The Second Shock Army under Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov launched a major offensive across the Volkhov in January 1942. This operation drove deep into German lines and created a significant salient that threatened to rupture the entire German position. The fighting to contain and eventually eliminate this Soviet penetration was among the most intense on the Northern Front. Dutch volunteers were engaged in this fighting, holding defensive positions in the forested marshland where mechanized warfare gave way to infantry combat at close range. The conditions of this fighting deserve attention because they define what the Dutch SS volunteers actually experienced. This was not the clean mobile warfare of popular imagination or SS propaganda films. This was fighting in frozen forests, defending muddy trenches against repeated Soviet assaults, often in temperatures well below -20 degrees Celsius. Casualties from exposure and disease ran alongside battle casualties. Supply was intermittent. Medical evacuation across difficult terrain in winter conditions was a serious challenge. Men died not only from Soviet bullets, but from frostbite, pneumonia, and the cumulative physical deterioration that came from months of inadequate rations, cold, and exhaustion. The Dutch Volunteer Legion suffered significant casualties during this period. Precise figures for individual engagements are difficult to establish from the available records, but the overall casualty rate for the formation over its Eastern Front service was high, reflecting the intensity of the fighting in the Volkhov sector. Replacements were fed in from ongoing recruitment in the Netherlands, which meant that the Legion never entirely ceased to exist as a coherent formation, even as its original members were killed or wounded. Anti-partisan operations formed another dimension of Dutch SS activity on the Eastern Front and in occupied Eastern territories. The German occupation of the Soviet Union generated substantial partisan activity behind the front lines from an early stage. Army Group North's rear areas were contested by Soviet partisan formations that disrupted supply lines, attacked German garrisons, and provided intelligence to Soviet commanders. The response of German and German allied forces to this partisan warfare was brutal, systematic, and in many cases constituted war crimes under any reasonable definition. The Dutch SS formations were involved in anti-partisan operations. The precise extent and nature of Dutch SS participation in atrocities remains a subject of historical investigation and some dispute. What is documented is that operations against partisans in the occupied Soviet Union routinely involved the killing of civilians, the destruction of villages, and practices that German military law of the time itself sometimes acknowledged as exceeding legitimate military necessity. Whether specific Dutch SS units participated directly in such actions and to what degree requires engagement with the specific documentary record rather than generalized assertion. The broader context is important. The Waffen-SS, of which the Dutch formations were a part, operated within a military and ideological system that sanctioned extreme violence in the East, defined the enemy in racial and ideological terms that dehumanized Soviet civilians as well as combatants, and provided institutional cover for crimes that would never have been permitted on the Western Front. Dutch volunteers who served in the system were part of that system, regardless of whether they personally committed atrocities. The moral weight of institutional participation is a distinct question from individual criminal responsibility, but it is not a trivial one. By 1943, the military situation on the Eastern Front had undergone a fundamental transformation. Stalingrad had destroyed the German Sixth Army, and broken the strategic momentum of the German war effort in the East. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 had demonstrated that even Germany's armoured striking power could no longer achieve decisive results against a Soviet military that had learned from 2 years of brutal experience. The war was moving in one direction, and the organisational response within the SS was to consolidate and upgrade its volunteer formations. The Vrijwilligerslegioen Nederland was disbanded in May 1943, and its personnel were incorporated into a new and substantially larger formation, the SS Vrijwilligen Panzergrenadier Brigade Nederland. This reorganisation reflected the SS's commitment to maintaining its Germanic volunteer formations as serious combat units rather than auxiliary forces, even as the political and propaganda rationale for their existence became increasingly disconnected from military reality. The brigade was organised around two Panzergrenadier regiments, designated SS Freiwilligen Panzergrenadier Regiment 48 De Ruyter and SS Freiwilligen Panzergrenadier Regiment 49 General Seifert. The naming of these regiments reflected a deliberate attempt to give the formation a Dutch identity. De Ruyter referred to Michiel de Ruyter, the celebrated 17th century Dutch admiral who had fought against England and France, a figure of considerable national prestige in the Netherlands. General Seifert was a recently murdered Dutch general who had been a prominent advocate of Dutch collaboration with Germany, assassinated by the Dutch resistance in February 1943. The use of de Ruyter's name was particularly striking. Here was one of the greatest heroes of Dutch national history being invoked as a symbolic patron for a formation fighting in German service on the Eastern Front. The SS propaganda apparatus was not subtle about this appropriation, and it reflected a genuine effort to reframe Dutch SS service not as collaboration, but as participation in a broader European struggle that stood in continuity with Dutch martial traditions. Whether Dutch volunteers found this framing convincing, or whether they had moved beyond the need for such justifications varied from individual to individual. The brigade's strength upon formation has been estimated by historians at approximately 4,000 to 5,000 men, though this figure fluctuated with casualties and replacement drafts. Command of the formation passed through several officers over its existence. Dutch officers served in various capacities within the unit, though overall command remained with German SS officers. The brigade continued to serve in the Army Group North area of operations through the second half of 1943 and into 1944. The strategic situation in this sector was deteriorating steadily from the German perspective. Soviet forces were building strength for a major effort to break the Leningrad siege, and German defensive capabilities were being stretched by the need to reinforce fronts further south, where the situation was even more critical. The Battle of Narva, fought in the first half of 1944, was among the most significant engagements of the Northern Front in this period. The city of Narva on the Estonian border with Russia became a critical defensive position as Soviet forces pushed westward following the relief of Leningrad in January 1944. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps, which included the Netherlands Brigade alongside Estonian, Flemish and German SS formations, fought a sustained defensive battle at Narva that lasted from February through the summer of 1944. The Narva battles have been described by historians as among the most intense defensive fighting on the Northern Front in 1944. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps held its positions against repeated Soviet assaults across the Narva River and in the bridgehead area east of the city. Dutch SS personnel were engaged in this fighting, which involved urban combat, river crossings and attritional infantry battles in difficult terrain. The Corps held Narva itself until July 1944, when a Soviet breakthrough to the south made the position untenable and forced a withdrawal to the Tannenberg Line. The withdrawal from Narva and the subsequent defensive fighting along the Tannenberg Line demonstrated both the continued military effectiveness of the SS volunteer formations and the fundamental strategic reality that Germany was losing the war. The Tannenberg Line position in Estonia held through the summer of 1944, but events elsewhere in the theatre forced its eventual abandonment. The Red Army's Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, destroyed Army Group Centre and fundamentally changed the entire eastern situation. By September 1944, German forces were withdrawing from Estonia entirely. In September 1943, the SS Vrijwilligen Panzergrenadier Brigade Nederland had been redesignated as the 23rd SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nederland. The redesignation to divisional status was partly organisational and partly a matter of prestige and propaganda, since the formation never reached full divisional strength in terms of personnel and equipment. This was a common pattern with Waffen-SS volunteer divisions in the later war years. Divisional designations that reflected aspirations and propaganda needs more than actual order of battle strength. The division's final phase of combat took it from Estonia through the Baltic region and eventually into the Courland Pocket, the German-held bridgehead in Latvia that was maintained by Sea Supply after Army Group North was cut off from the rest of the German front in October 1944. The Courland Pocket became a massive defensive enclave where several German armies, including SS formations, fought until the final German surrender in May 1945. Some elements of the division, however, were evacuated from Courland by sea and committed to defensive fighting in Pomerania and the final battles in Germany. The final weeks of the division's existence were characterized by the chaos and disintegration typical of German military formations in the last phase of the war. Units were fragmented, cut off, or absorbed into improvised combat groups. Men sought to move westward to surrender to British or American forces rather than fall into Soviet hands, a preference driven not only by the ideological framework of their service, but by a practical understanding of what Soviet captivity would likely mean for men who had fought against the Red Army for years. The few who fell into Soviet hands generally did not return to the Netherlands until years later, if they returned at all. The question of war crimes committed by Dutch SS formations is one that requires careful and precise treatment. It cannot be dismissed or minimized, but neither can it be addressed by attribution of guilt through association alone. The Waffen-SS as an organization was declared a criminal organization by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. This declaration, however, did not automatically make every individual member of a Waffen-SS formation a war criminal, and the Nuremberg Tribunal explicitly excluded from the criminal organization finding those members who had been conscripted into the Waffen-SS against their will, as well as members who had not personally participated in criminal acts. For Dutch SS volunteers, who were by definition volunteers rather than conscripts, the organizational criminality finding carried more weight. But the specific actions of the Dutch formations on the Eastern Front require examination on their own terms. The most significant documented cases of potential war crimes involving Dutch SS personnel fall into two broad categories. The first is participation in anti-partisan operations that, by the standards of international law then as now, regarding anti-partisan operations, the record is complex. German counterpartisan doctrine in the occupied Soviet Union routinely required that entire villages suspected of supporting partisan activity be burned and their populations killed or deported. Dutch SS formations operating in the rear areas of Army Group North operated within this doctrinal framework. The extent to which specific Dutch SS units participated in such operations and the individual culpability of Dutch volunteers who did so remains a subject of historical research. The involvement of Dutch SS volunteers in the Holocaust is a more clearly documented matter in some respects. Dutch volunteers who served in various SS security and police formations within the Netherlands itself were directly involved in the deportation of Dutch Jews. This is distinct from the frontline Waffen-SS formations, but it represents a dimension of Dutch SS service that cannot be ignored in any comprehensive account. The line between Waffen-SS frontline service and SS security apparatus service was sometimes blurry, particularly in the occupied Eastern Territories where SS formations of various kinds operated in close proximity. Dutch historian Geraldine von Freytag-Drabe-Kunzel and others who have examined this question have noted that Dutch SS volunteers existed within an institutional framework that explicitly linked military service with the racial and ideological project of the SS. Whether or not an individual Dutch volunteer fired a gun at a Jewish civilian or participated in the burning of a village, his service provided military manpower for a system that carried out these actions as a matter of policy. The moral and legal questions arising from this institutional participation are genuine and have been debated seriously in Dutch historiography. For the purposes of this account, what can be stated with confidence is this: Dutch SS volunteers served in formations that were part of the Waffen-SS, which operated alongside and often in coordination with SS security formations that committed systematic mass atrocities. Dutch volunteers participated in anti-partisan operations that in many cases involved crimes against civilians. Some individual Dutch SS members were prosecuted and convicted of specific war crimes in post-war Dutch trials. The full extent of Dutch SS involvement in atrocities on the Eastern Front remains imperfectly documented, partly because the relevant records were incomplete, destroyed, or inaccessible in Soviet archives for decades after the war. Within the Netherlands itself, the men who volunteered for German SS service occupied a particular and deeply uncomfortable position in Dutch social life, even during the occupation. The majority of the Dutch population did not collaborate with the German occupation in any active sense. They accommodated themselves to it, as occupied populations generally do, but they did not embrace it. The Dutch resistance, while not as large or as romantically presented as post-war memory suggested, was real. Underground newspapers circulated, resistance networks helped Allied airmen escape. Later in the occupation, Labour Service evaders were hidden in attics and barns. The moral framework of Dutch civilian society distinguished clearly between those who resisted, those who accommodated, and those who actively collaborated. The men in German uniforms fell unambiguously into the last category. Their families knew it. Their neighbours knew it. In towns and villages where NSB membership was visible and where young men had publicly departed for SS training, everyone knew who had gone and what they had gone to do. Letters home from the front, occasional leave visits, and German newsreels that occasionally featured Dutch volunteers all kept the fact of their service present in civilian consciousness. The reaction of Dutch civilians to these men was not uniform. In communities where NSB membership was concentrated, the social support for volunteers was stronger. Families were proud of sons and brothers who had, in their own framework, answered a patriotic call. Local NSB networks provided informal support systems for families of men serving at the front. German authorities recognized and cultivated this social infrastructure, understanding that the families of volunteers represented a constituency with a direct stake in German victory. Outside NSB circles, the reaction ranged from indifference to open hostility. The Dutch resistance targeted collaborators of all kinds, and men who had volunteered for German service and their families were not exempt from this targeting. The assassination of General Seyffert in February 1943, which the resistance carried out with considerable planning and some operational skill, demonstrated that the resistance was capable of reaching prominent collaborators even when they had German protection. The return of men on leave from the Eastern Front into Dutch society was an inherently uncomfortable event. A man in Waffen-SS uniform walking through a Dutch city represented the intersection of two worlds that Dutch civilian society was trying to keep separate. The presence of such a man was both a reminder of the occupation's depth of penetration into Dutch life and a provocation to the resistance and to the majority of the population that regarded collaboration as a fundamental moral failure. German propaganda worked hard to manage this social dynamic. Dutch SS volunteers were presented in Dutch SS publications and in the Dutch press that operated under German censorship as heroes defending Europe, as patriots serving a cause that transcended narrow national interest, as men making the supreme sacrifice in a struggle that would determine the future of civilization. The publications used photographs, personal testimonies from volunteers, and accounts of battlefield decorations to construct a heroic narrative of Dutch SS service. This narrative had a limited audience. It reached those already committed to collaboration and their immediate social networks. For the broad mass of the Dutch population, it was propaganda in the most literal sense. Communication designed not to inform but to persuade, and recognizable as such by most of its nominal recipients. The German occupation had not created genuine popular enthusiasm for Dutch SS service. It had created a situation in which a small minority of ideologically committed men, and a somewhat larger number of men with mixed or opportunistic motivations, had taken a path that the majority of their countrymen regarded as treasonous. The Dutch resistance was careful to distinguish in its own moral accounting between different categories of collaboration. Active military service in German formations was at the far end of the spectrum, beyond economic collaboration, beyond administrative accommodation, beyond the various forms of compromise that ordinary Dutch life under occupation required. The man who delivered mail for a German-run postal service was not in the same moral category as the man who carried a rifle in an SS uniform on the Eastern Front. Dutch resistance thinking was not always as nuanced in practice as it was in principle, but this broad distinction was real and reflected genuine moral reasoning. As the war entered its final phase in late 1944 and early 1945, the men of the 23rd SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nederland faced the increasingly inescapable reality that the cause for which they had fought was collapsing. The strategic situation that had brought them to the Eastern Front in 1941 had been entirely reversed. The Soviet Union, which they had marched east to destroy, was driving toward Berlin, The division's final months were characterized by defensive fighting of increasing desperation. Elements of the division that had been withdrawn from Courland were committed to the defense of Pomerania in early 1945. The Soviet offensive into Pomerania, launched in February 1945, was overwhelming in its weight and momentum. German forces in the region, including the remnants of the Netherlands Division, were unable to establish stable defensive positions against the pressure of Soviet armour and infantry. The fighting in Pomerania in February and March 1945 was brutal. The Soviet forces committed to this operation had years of combat experience, substantial material superiority, and the momentum of victories stretching back from Stalingrad through Kursk and across the entire breadth of the Eastern Front. The German formations opposing them were fighting with depleted strength, dwindling ammunition, and the knowledge that there was no strategic reserve capable of stabilizing the front. For Dutch SS men in Pomeranian forests and fields, this was a fight not for victory, but for survival. The collapse of organized resistance in many sectors meant that the division disintegrated as a coherent formation in its final weeks. Men sought to move westward toward the Elbe River, toward the zones that British and American forces were advancing into, toward the possibility of surrender to an opponent who would not, they calculated, treat them as the Red Army would. The calculation was not unreasonable. Soviet treatment of captured SS men was generally harsh, and men who had spent years fighting the Red Army had no illusions about what capture by Soviet forces likely meant. Some Dutch SS men did surrender to Soviet forces or were captured in the fighting. Their fate was typically prolonged captivity in Soviet prison camps, with repatriation to the Netherlands, if it occurred at all, not happening until the early 1950s or later. The Soviet camp system for SS prisoners was brutal, and the mortality rate was significant. Those who succeeded in reaching British or American lines surrendered in the final days of the war. For them, captivity under Western Allied control was in most respects safer, though it was followed by transfer to Dutch custody and the prospect of prosecution under Dutch law. The total casualties suffered by Dutch SS formations over the course of the war are difficult to establish with precision. Historians estimate that of the approximately 8,000 to 10,000 Dutch men who served in frontline Waffen-SS formations, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 were killed. These figures are estimates based on available records and should be understood as approximations rather than definitive figures. The surviving veterans, several thousand men, returned to the Netherlands after the war to face a very different reception than the recruitment propaganda had promised. The end of the war in the Netherlands on the 5th of May 1945 was met with massive public celebration. The liberation by Canadian and British forces and the relief of the terrible hunger winter that had killed approximately 20,000 Dutch civilians in the winter of 1944-45 produced an outpouring of joy that was also, inevitably, tinged with the need to account for what had happened during 5 years of occupation. The Dutch government, operating first from London and then returning to the Netherlands, had established legal frameworks for dealing with collaboration before the war ended. Bijzondere rechtspleging, special justice, was the system established to try Dutch citizens who had collaborated with the German occupation. The scope of this system was enormous. By some estimates, over 100,000 Dutch citizens were investigated or detained in the immediate post-war period in connection with various forms of collaboration. For Dutch SS veterans, the legal consequences were among the most severe available under Dutch law. Military service in German formations was treated as participation in the enemy's war effort, a fundamental betrayal of national loyalty. The fact that the volunteers had been volunteers, that they had sworn oaths to Adolf Hitler, that they had fought under the SS flag against Allied forces, made their cases straightforward from a legal standpoint, even when specific war crimes charges were difficult to establish. The special courts established under the Bijzondere rechtspleging system tried thousands of Dutch collaborators in the years following the liberation. Dutch SS veterans who were identified and apprehended faced charges of collaboration, treason, and in some cases specific war crimes. The penalties imposed ranged from short prison terms for the less seriously implicated to lengthy terms of imprisonment for those found guilty of more serious offences. A small number of Dutch SS men were sentenced to death and executed. The figures for executions of Dutch collaborators after the war are modest by comparison with countries like France, where the epuration reached into the thousands. In the Netherlands, the post-war executions of collaborators numbered in the dozens, with somewhere between 30 and 40 men actually executed following judicial proceedings. Among those executed were Dutch SS members convicted of participation in specific atrocities or killings. The stripping of Dutch citizenship was a more widespread consequence. Men who had served in German military formations were subject to civil penalties that included loss of voting rights, loss of civil service positions, and in some cases formal deprivation of citizenship itself. These penalties affected not only the men themselves, but in some cases their families, creating lasting social and legal stigma that extended beyond the individual. The wives and children of Dutch SS veterans inhabited a difficult social position in post-war Dutch society. The social ostracism was, in many respects, more total and more lasting than the legal penalties. Post-war Dutch society constructed a memory of the occupation that emphasized resistance and suffering while minimizing collaboration. The canonical image of the Dutch wartime experience centered on figures like Anne Frank, on the dock workers' strike of February 1941, that protested the deportation of Amsterdam Jews, on the underground resistance networks, and on the suffering of the hunger winter. Within this memory framework, the Dutch SS volunteer had no legitimate place. He was simply a traitor, an aberration, a man who had chosen the wrong side and deserved the consequences. This memory framework served important social and political functions in post-war Dutch society. It provided a coherent national narrative of victimhood and resistance that allowed the country to move forward, rebuild its social institutions, and re-establish its sense of collective identity after the trauma of occupation. But it was, historians have increasingly recognized, a selective and incomplete account of what actually happened between 1940 and 1945. The reality was more complicated. The Netherlands had not been a society of resistors with a small collaborating fringe. The NSB had had 50,000 members. Tens of thousands of Dutch men had served in various German formations. The Dutch police and civil administration had, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and various degrees of coercion, assisted in the deportation of Dutch Jews to the death camps. The Netherlands had the highest rate of Jewish mortality of any Western European country under German occupation. Approximately 73% of Dutch Jews, more than 100,000 people, were murdered. This tragedy was not the work of Germans alone. The post-war reckoning with Dutch SS veterans was thus one part of a larger, slower, and more painful process of confronting what Dutch society had actually done and not done during the occupation. This process continued for decades and in some respects continues today. The Dutch SS veteran occupied an extreme position within this reckoning. He was the most visible and most easily defined collaborator, the man who had put on a uniform and taken up a weapon. But the historical excavation of Dutch collaboration in its broader dimensions revealed that the distance between the SS volunteer and the ordinary Dutch citizen who had cooperated with German administrative demands was sometimes smaller than post-war memory preferred to acknowledge. The veterans themselves, those who survived, lived with the consequences of their wartime choices in various ways. Some maintained their ideological commitments, continued to associate with small right-wing groups that preserved a version of the wartime pan-Germanic ideology, and defined their wartime service in terms of an anti-communist crusade that history had unfortunately judged harshly. Some broke entirely with their wartime past, sought to rebuild ordinary lives, and had little to say publicly about their service. Some found accommodation with Dutch society on terms that required neither full repentance nor open defiance. They had served, they had been punished, they were getting on with their lives. The legal disqualifications on Dutch SS veterans were partially lifted over the decades following the war, partly through specific amnesties, and partly through the general passage of time. By the 1960s and 70s, most surviving Dutch SS veterans had regained their civil rights, though the social stigma in many cases persisted. The last veterans died in the 1990s and 2000s, taking with them first-hand knowledge of experiences that had been shaped by one of the most extreme ideological conflicts in European history. How did the Dutch in the Netherlands view the Eastern Front fighting while it was happening? The German occupation authorities controlled the Dutch press and used it to publicise the activities of Dutch SS volunteers in terms that emphasised their heroism, their sacrifice, and their contribution to the common European struggle. Dutch SS newsletters and propaganda publications celebrated Iron Cross recipients, reported on the formation's engagements, and published letters from the front that were curated to project courage and commitment. The Iron Cross was indeed awarded to a number of Dutch SS men for actions on the Eastern Front. Among those who received the Iron Cross First Class were individuals whose names appear in the available records of the formations in question. The Knight's Cross, the highest level of the decoration, was awarded to several Dutch SS members. Among these was Gerardus Moyman, a Dutch volunteer who received the Knight's Cross in February 1943 for actions in the Volkhov sector, where, as a member of an anti-tank gun crew, he was credited with the destruction of a significant number of Soviet tanks during a Soviet armoured assault. Moyman was the first non-German Western European volunteer to receive the Knight's Cross, and the German propaganda apparatus made considerable use of his image and his story. Whether German propaganda's use of Moyman's achievement captured what the man himself actually thought and felt about his service is a more complex question. Moyman survived the war, returned to the Netherlands, served a prison sentence, and lived until 1991. His public statements over the years were few and carefully worded. Like many Dutch SS veterans, he inhabited the difficult position of a man whose wartime deeds had been both militarily recognised and morally condemned by the society from which he came. Other Dutch officers rose through the ranks of the Netherlands formations to command at various levels. The Dutch SS never produced a general officer in the Waffen-SS, but company grade and battalion level command was exercised by Dutch officers who had risen from the enlisted ranks through demonstrated competence in combat. These men were, by any military measure, effective soldiers. The formations they served in, whatever one thinks of the cause for which they fought, were regarded by German commanders as reliable frontline troops. This military effectiveness creates one of the central tensions in any historical assessment of the Dutch SS. These men were not, for the most part, the criminal thugs of popular imagination. Many were ideologically committed, militarily competent individuals who endured extraordinary hardship in service to a cause that the verdict of history has condemned without reservation. The combination of genuine military quality and service to a criminal system is not a paradox that resolves itself comfortably in either direction. The historiography of Dutch SS service has evolved substantially since the immediate post-war years. The first generation of Dutch historians writing about the occupation period tended to treat collaboration as a relatively simple phenomenon of moral failure, best explained by psychological weakness, greed, or cynical opportunism. The Dutch SS volunteer in this framework was a traitor who had betrayed his country for personal advantage or ideological delusion. Later, scholarship complicated this picture significantly. Historians including Louis de Jong, whose monumental multi-volume history of the Netherlands in the Second World War remains the foundational work in the field, attempted to situate collaboration within a more complete account of Dutch society during the occupation. De Jong's work, produced over decades and completed in the 1980s, provided a more nuanced account that acknowledged the range of motivations, the social pressures, and the ideological frameworks that had driven Dutch men into German service, while maintaining a clear moral judgment about the nature of that service. More recent Dutch scholarship has continued to probe the complexity of collaboration while also deepening the account of Dutch complicity in the Holocaust. Works examining the role of Dutch civil administration, Dutch police, and Dutch social institutions in the murder of Dutch Jews have shifted the frame of historical inquiry away from a binary of collaboration versus resistance and toward a more demanding examination of how a society accommodates itself to an occupying power and what the moral consequences of that accommodation are. Within this broader historiographical context, the Dutch SS volunteer occupies a defined but not entirely singular position. He was the most extreme collaborator, the one who had crossed the line from accommodation into active armed service. But the continuities between his trajectory and the trajectories of other Dutch men who had made different choices, more moderate, less visible, less easily condemned, are part of what serious historical inquiry has been forced to confront. The specific question of anti-communist motivation deserves separate attention. For many Dutch SS volunteers, anti-Bolshevism was genuinely the primary motivation for enlistment. The Soviet Union was, in their framework, a genuinely threatening and genuinely evil power. The atrocities of Soviet collectivization, the political terror of the purges, and the ideological project of international communism were real phenomena that had real consequences for real people, including Dutch citizens who had experienced the Spanish Civil War or had connections to Eastern European countries. The anti-communist motivation was not invented by SS propaganda. It reflected a genuine ideological commitment that many Europeans across the political spectrum shared in some form. The fact that anti-communism was a genuine motivation does not, of course, absolve the volunteers of the consequences of their choices. Fighting for an anti-communist cause meant fighting as part of an SS system that carried out genocide, mass murder, and systematic terror. The anti-communist motivation does not exist in isolation from the context of what the SS was and what it did, but understanding that motivation is necessary for understanding why these men made the choices they made, and that understanding is distinct from endorsement or excuse. The pan-Germanic motivation was for some volunteers equally sincere and equally significant. The idea that the Dutch, the Germans, the Flemish, and the other Germanic peoples of northwestern Europe constituted a natural racial and cultural community that transcended the boundaries of nation-states had been an element of Dutch nationalist and fascist thought since the 1930s. For men who had absorbed this framework, SS service was not collaboration with a foreign power. It was participation in the realization of a community to which they genuinely believed they belonged. This self-understanding was, from the perspective of the Dutch nation-state and of post-war international law, entirely inadmissible as a defence. The Netherlands was a recognised sovereign state. Its citizens owed it loyalty under the laws of war. Taking up arms against the Allied forces, which the Netherlands government in exile had aligned itself with from an early stage, was by any legal definition treason. The SS volunteers claimed to be acting not as a traitor, but as a participant in a European crusade had no standing in Dutch law or in the moral framework of the occupied Netherlands. But history is not only concerned with legal definitions, it is also concerned with understanding how human beings make choices, what frameworks they use to give those choices meaning, and how those frameworks relate to the broader contexts of power, ideology, and circumstance in which individuals find themselves. Understanding the Dutch SS volunteer requires engagement with all of these dimensions. There is a final accounting that this documentary must address, and it concerns numbers in the most fundamental sense: the dead. Of the Dutch men who volunteered for service in the Vrijwilligerslegioen Nederland, the SS Vrijwilligen Panzergrenadier Brigade Nederland, and the 23rd SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nederland, a substantial proportion did not survive the war. Historians have estimated the killed in action figure for Dutch Waffen-SS frontline volunteers at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men, from a total volunteer pool of approximately 8,000 to 10,000 frontline soldiers across the various formations. These are not small numbers relative to the size of the volunteer pool. The casualty rates reflect the intensity of the fighting on the northern sector of the Eastern Front, where the Dutch formations served for most of the war. The Volkhov battles, the Narva fighting, the Courland defensive battles, and the final collapse in Pomerania all took their toll. Men who had marched east in the summer and autumn of 1941, with the expectation of a short, victorious campaign, found themselves in a years-long ordeal of attritional warfare that ground down their formations regardless of tactical skill or individual courage. These dead were someone's sons. Many were someone's husbands, someone's fathers. They had families in the Netherlands who received notifications of their deaths, who mourned them, and who then had to navigate the post-war social environment as the relatives of men who had been officially and publicly branded as traitors. The grief of families of Dutch SS dead was not publicly legitimated in post-war Dutch society in the way that the grief of families of resistance fighters or of victims of the occupation was. It existed privately, sometimes secretly, in a social context that offered it no recognition and no comfort. This is not an argument for the legitimacy of their choices or their cause. It is simply an observation about the human dimensions of what happened to real people in a real historical catastrophe of extraordinary scale and violence. The veterans who survived, several thousand men, lived out their lives in post-war Dutch society under conditions that range from genuine social rehabilitation to lifelong marginalization. Those who had committed specific crimes were punished by the courts. Those who had not were nonetheless marked by their service in ways that affected their employment prospects, their social relationships, and in some cases, their family lives. The social stigma of SS service in the Netherlands was among the most persistent of any Western European country. This persistence reflects the depth of the wound that the occupation and collaboration inflicted on Dutch society. In countries where collaboration had been more widespread, where the lines of social complicity had been harder to draw, the post-war settlement tended toward broader amnesty and earlier normalization. In the Netherlands, the concentration of active collaboration in the identifiable NSB community and the SS volunteer formations allowed the rest of Dutch society to maintain a cleaner self-image, to draw the line between us and them with greater confidence, and to sustain the stigma of SS service for longer. Whether this was just is a question that Dutch society has continued to debate in various ways. The broader recognition arriving in Dutch historiography from the 1980s onward that Dutch complicity in the Holocaust extended far beyond the NSB and the SS into the civil administration, the police, and the general social fabric, has complicated the clean moral geography of post-war Dutch memory. If many more Dutch people bear some degree of moral responsibility for what happened during the occupation than post-war memory acknowledged, then the distribution of stigma and accountability requires reconsideration. This does not mean, and it has not meant in Dutch historical writing, a rehabilitation of the Dutch SS volunteer. It means a more complete account in which his choices are understood in relation to the choices of others, in which the entire moral landscape of Dutch society under occupation is made visible rather than selectively illuminated. We return finally to the question with which this documentary began: warriors or traitors? The Dutch volunteers who served in Waffen-SS formations on the Eastern Front were, in the most straightforward legal and political sense, traitors. They were Dutch citizens who took up arms in the service of a power that had militarily conquered their country and subjected it to a brutal occupation. They fought under a flag that represented an ideology that murdered 6 million Jews and tens of millions of others. They served in formations that were integral to a system of racial terror. The Dutch courts that tried and punished them after the war were applying well-established principles of law to conduct that was, by any reasonable standard, treasonous. They were also, in a purely military sense, warriors. They fought under extreme conditions, suffered very high casualties, endured years of combat on one of the most brutal fronts in the history of warfare, and in many cases demonstrated genuine military competence and individual courage. The Iron Crosses and Knight's Cross decorations that some of them received were not fabricated. They reflected real actions in real battles that cost real lives on both sides, and the coexistence of these two descriptions is precisely the problem. History does not resolve it by choosing one label and discarding the other. It resolves it, if resolution is the right word, by insisting on the full complexity of what these men were and what they did. They were ideologically committed volunteers, most of them, who had made a genuine choice to serve in the SS. They were anti-communists in many cases, and this motivation was real, though it did not exempt them from responsibility for the context in which their anti-communism was expressed. They were participants in a pan-Germanic ideological project that was, at its core, a racial fantasy that justified and produced mass murder. They were soldiers who fought hard and died in large numbers in a losing cause. They were citizens who betrayed the state they were born into. They were men who returned, those who did return, to a country that did not want them and a society that had no place for them. Modern Dutch historians have generally moved away from the simple traitor label without moving toward rehabilitation or valorization. The scholarly consensus, to the extent that one exists, treats the Dutch SS as a specific product of the intersection of Dutch fascism, German occupation, SS recruitment strategy, and the ideological polarization of the European war. They are studied as historical actors whose choices illuminate the deeper pathologies of European politics in the 1930s and 1940s, not as heroes or as simple villains. What the Dutch SS experience ultimately reveals is the capacity of political ideology, social pressure, and the circumstances of occupation to move men toward choices that, in other circumstances, they would never have made. Some of these men were convinced ideologues who had sought this path from the moment the NSB posters first went up in the early 1930s. Others were products of their moment, men who had been moved by the particular combination of ideological climate and historical circumstance into a trajectory that consumed years of their lives and in many cases ended those lives in frozen forests far from the flat green country they had left. Understanding this is not the same as forgiving it. It is not the same as excusing it. It is the work that history is obligated to do to reconstruct as fully and as honestly as possible what happened and why, and to resist the simplifications that make us comfortable at the cost of accuracy. The Dutch SS were warriors. They were traitors. They were a product of their time and their choices. History holds all of these things simultaneously and refuses to let any one of them go.